Hello everybody. Today I'm going to focus upon the topic of assessment and evaluation, particularly focused upon reading and later reading and writing and literacy. You'll find that I shift back and forth, almost shuttle back and forth, be talking about education assessment and testing and evaluation, and reading assessment and evaluation, reading, writing assessment and evaluation. The shuttling back and forth is sort of natural because to a large extent, as educational testing developed, reading assessments were integral to those assessments. Indeed, if you think about it, reading is a central part of the educational assessment and sometimes the proxy by which one measures educational advancements, educational developments, educational achievement. So oftentimes as I talk about educational assessment, hand in hand with that were developments in reading assessment, and certainly influences in a similar fashion, or influences which were basically the same. So I'll talk a little bit about assessment and evaluation. I'm using the word assessment to denote, in a sense, the collection of data, the method of observing people or getting them to respond to issues by which you then evaluate them. The two go hand in hand. In other words, it's hard to imagine how one could actually do one without the other. Indeed, evaluation typically follows from, but it's actually also a precursor to whatever one does in terms of assessment, because assessment is done for reasons, sometimes quite political reasons, sometimes tied to social perspectives that I actually consider to be somewhat problematic, as well as sometimes related to, and oftentimes in education, related to advancing teaching and learning. And so what I'll try to do is give you a quick sense of the nature and role of assessment to broaden your thinking a little bit about it. I will talk a little bit about historical traces which have influenced assessment and what were some of the first tests that were developed in education and reading. I will then sort of talk about the influence of some of the shifts that we've been looking at, the cognitive turn, for example, psycholinguistics, the social turn, the critical turn, and what impact that had on tests at different points in our history. And then I'll close with a discussion of some considerations. I don't think we're really fully dealing with the issues in assessment in the educational world. I think there are areas that we really need to delve into further. You will find that as I talk about assessment in terms of considerations, you'll find that I typically are focusing in on what are the considerations relative to to what extent assessment really matches what our understandings are of literacy and what the consequences are of tests. Implicit in all of this will be discussions of validity, discussions of reliability. In other words, what is measured, how well is it measured reliably, in a fashion that's verifiable, so that one can actually act with a sense of confidence that this is a reasonable sample of somebody's behavior. And also you'll see that I'm focusing a lot on uses. But let me sort of shape it a little bit by sort of getting you to think a little bit about assessment historically. And maybe you could even think about it historically in your own lives. As I contemplate my life, I have sharp recall of being tested as a young child in terms of reading, both orally and in terms of comprehension. I remember the high stakes of it too. I remember tests being given to me when I was 15 and 17 and being in classes of large numbers of students, and then the next year there might not be that many students, particularly in terms of graduating forward in terms of high school and then on to university. I think I started off with a class of about 600 students in my first year of high school. After the third year of high school, a lot of students did an exam and then decided to go into apprenticeships and other fields. And I think I was down to about a quarter of those students. Then as I went to high school, end of high school, we had what was I felt like a year preparing to do an exam, which was at that time called the Leaving Certificate. And the results came out in the newspaper on Christmas Eve. And the results were the trauma of this sort of high stakes thing in our lives was hugely significant. A group of us went to town to see the first release of the results in the newspaper by name, with our grades listed, if in fact we had passed. And I think of the group of 8 guys that were with me at that point in time, I think there were 4 of them whose name wasn't listed, in other words, didn't pass. And of those 4 who did pass, I think maybe 2 of us went on to university. I always sort of thought when I finished my education that finally that would be the last time I'd be tested. In other words, when I did my doctoral defense, I thought, oh my God, I'm finally liberated from the world of testing. However, I had been a teacher, so I wasn't really liberated from it, but I was being liberated from being tested myself. I quickly realized that indeed testing was a part of everybody's life, because about 2 months after I finished my doctorate, I had to go and get my driver's license, and so I was subjected to a test in the US for being able to drive. And then occasionally I've sort of been tested by tax audits and tested within the university. Indeed, in Australia, at the university, there's such a management mentality that I was constantly having to declare my objectives and show how I would measure whether or not I had achieved those objectives. And my salary increases were sort of tied to whether or not I had actually engaged in this cycle of testing. Every day I check the weather. I look, and a lot of times I check the currency exchanges. And so I'm constantly in my life sort of looking at issues of testing. And as a teacher of this course, I'm thinking, well, how do I engage in effective assessment of my students? How do I actually help myself be well informed? And how might I give my students feedback? How might I observe them? How might I collect data that enables me to customize the course to their needs? And so I'm sort of involved in assessment in an ongoing moment-by-moment fashion, and then periodically looking for ways to be involved in assessment. Plus, as an educator, I'm looking for ways by which students, learners, can actually assess themselves. I think a missing goal from assessment historically has been, how do we help people, our students, assess themselves, establish their plans, their goals, and ways to look at, in fact, the achievement of their goals. In some subject areas, I think, for example, in the arts and whatnot, you see much more effective attempts by educators to engage students in becoming connoisseurs of their work and setting goals for their work. Too often in the educational enterprise, in certain subject areas, we determine how we're doing by the teacher's assessment of themselves rather than our own assessment of themselves.